I'm not kidding when I tell you that Jeffrey Melnick might be the coolest dude I've ever met in my life. I love this podcast. It has opened up my world to so much scholarship and the ideas behind the scholarship, the personalities behind the scholarship, getting to talk to like the best freaking historians in the absolute entire world. I cannot believe the caliber and quality of historians that want to come on and talk about movies with me. For you guys, sometimes I'm just this guy that happened to start this thing a few years ago. And the enthusiasm for this has been crazy. And I got to tell you, sometimes I align guests because I think, oh, here's this really important movie, or we're coming up and there's a thing or whatever. And in this regard, all I wanted to do was hang out with my friend Jeff. And I say my friend Jeff because before this podcast, I had never actually met this dude before. I'd never actually spoken to him like one-on-one. We still haven't met like in person. He was a dude who I had seen on Twitter. I don't even know how we became friends. I think we get into this during the pod. I was like, this guy's cool. And if you know anything about Jeffrey Melnick or me, like we couldn't be more different guys. Just from New York, I'm from Kentucky. I barbecue everything. Jeff is a devout vegetarian, and we tease each other relentlessly about this. And what I have to tell you is that, first and foremost, Melnick is an amazing scholar, right? He's written all this different stuff, and he does this amazing work. He's over at UMass Boston. And if you have the opportunity, if you are a student at a university in the greater Boston area, because I know a lot of these schools have the ability to go back and forth. And if you're a student at one school, you can take classes. Go take a class with Jeff Melnick. He is the coolest guy, I swear to God. And he's putting together all this amazing stuff on like pop culture in the past. And he actually wrote this book on the Manson murders, which brought us to this whole idea of doing Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, this Quentin Tarantino film that goes back and tells us alternate history, or alternate facts, to borrow maybe verbiage from the previous presidency that I've tried so hard to forget about. But we get so much into these ideas during this podcast about the use of counterfactuals, the ideas behind what maybe conservative voices find challenging, the ideas behind families in the 2000s, in the 1990s, in the 1980s, and the 1970s. This was such an amazing time just to sit and talk down to Jeff. He has so many great, amazing ideas that I think you guys are going to love. And of course, this movie is just batshit crazy, like a lot of them. I think if you've seen Once Upon in Hollywood, there's probably no spoiler alert here, so I'm not going to spoil the film for you. But it takes some really weird turns during this movie. We get into all of that. So this is a hell of a ride. This is one of my favorite podcasts we've ever done. You guys are going to love this. It's time to sit back and relax. Strap on your seatbelts, because Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is next in the Stories of the Movies podcast. Hey, Jeff Melnick, where are you?
I'm in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Came here for grad school and never escaped, and bizarrely raised my children here. And one of them has a Boston accent, and we don't know what to do about that. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay. All right. My Massachusetts exposure is very limited. Like, some of my ancestors are from there. Like, I've got Chadwick ancestors buried in Cambridge. Like, I get on like those
Sounds
grave
right.
finders and ancestry and all that kind of stuff. And I found out, like, apparently we came across from England to Massachusetts, to Carolina, and then over to Kentucky. So we got this weird Z immigration thing going on.
Yeah. I was going to try to figure out what shape that is, but I didn't do well with geometry, so I can't help you out there.
Yeah. Well, then like my entire like life then goes on from like Kentucky to Louisiana to Tennessee to Kentucky to Florida, Massachusetts.
I was going to say you're in Florida. You're in Florida now.
Yeah. Florida's interesting because it's not relevant to our times whatsoever. Nothing odd here at all.
Wish you could hit the news someday, but it hasn't been your time yet.
Oh my God, it is a dumpster fire down here. So I've got to drive down to Fort Lauderdale tomorrow, which is like an hour and a half away. And I've got to hopefully find gas tonight because we've had all this rain down in like Fort Lauderdale, Miami. In Florida, we have 2 seasons, right? We have wet season and dry season. We don't have your conventional 4 seasons. So we've been getting a lot of rain, fortunately, because we've actually had some really poor wet seasons the last few years. So the rain is actually a good thing, but we're unprepared for some reason. I don't know. I think maybe our governor's like running for president. I can't quite figure it out, but whatever.
Something's going on there. Yeah.
He seems to like the television. It's like I can't get away from him.
And it's amazing because he's remarkably not telegenic. And I'm just like, I'm not even saying that from a political point of view, but just like he's not good at it. Like he's kind of clunky. And
can I tell you, like, so the interesting thing about him, and I feel like I talk about this guy like more than my own kids at this point in time, but my kids need less direction apparently.
Exactly.
The interesting thing with his thing is he came in when he got elected initially the first time. He just barely won that election. It was very tight contested, and he kind of ruled with a mandate afterwards. But hey, if you're going to come in, I kind of get it. And there was like this preemptive, like, hey, he's the next guy. And what we're seeing right now, especially this shirt I'm wearing, this Walt Disney World shirt, is not by accident.
Love it.
He's proving himself to be an utterly incapable politician. He's really not good at this. And I think people were like crowning him as the next big thing, but it turns out he's not very deft at all when it comes to this.
And it's weird. I have to do this about putting on as a scholar of popular culture. It's like, you don't go after Disney. People like Disney. People get married at Disney. People go on multi-generational.
He got married at Disney.
Oh, is that right? I didn't even know that.
Oh yeah. He got married at Disney. I worked at Disney, dude. Like, especially in Florida, man. Disney's our thing. There are 2 things you don't mess with in Florida. You don't mess with the water, and you don't mess with Disney. Because like, everybody here is like clean water, clean water, clean water. Even like across the political spectrum, like they call them conservation conservatives here.
Interesting.
Like very much like you'll see like even like the good old boys with the big trucks and stuff like that, which is fun. I've got a big truck myself, right? You'll see like these stickers in the back of trucks, like captains for clean water and stuff like that, which is good.
Wow.
I tend to think clean water is a good thing. Shouldn't really be contested. But you don't mess with the mouse. And Bob Iger is just like, I feel it's like, I don't know, it's like an episode of The Wire, man. It's like Come for the King, best not miss or something, because it's...
Exactly. Dude, and he's missing hard, yeah.
Well, I saw Disney was going to have a bunch of layoffs the other day, and I was like, who's not getting laid off? The lawyers. Yeah, the attorneys are not... Right. I mean...
So true.
I don't know what he's... It feels almost like if we're like when I talk about Nixon, or excuse me, when I talk about Johnson going into Vietnam, and it's like he knows he can't get out of Vietnam. Like there's no winnable solution, but we've got to go in anyway because his pride won't allow him to back down. I don't know. I don't know where this thing is going to go from here.
Yeah, no, it's fast, and it's just fast. I mean, it's very high stakes, so I'm trying not to enjoy it too much. But there is that part of me that's like, wow, swing and a miss. Like he keeps, like he thinks. Like, those guys in like junior high who like the mean boy makes a joke and like the third boy down tries to like join the joke, but does it slightly wrong. Like he keeps being that like third or fourth guy down who doesn't quite get how to trumpet correctly, like, and so he's awkward and he's weird and just everything doesn't land. It's kind of remarkable.
There was an interesting thing going on, and I promise the listeners that we'll eventually talk about movies or whatever. You know what? I promise you people nothing. At this point in time, everyone should know to keep your expectations low. This is my show, damn it. This is the same guy who told the audience to go to hell if they hadn't seen Aliens the other day. We were like,
fair. That's just fair. That's fair.
Like there should be spoilers. I'm like, no, there should not be spoilers for Aliens. If you haven't seen this movie by now, something's wrong with you.
You had your chance.
Yeah, you had your chance. Now with this one, you're listening to a movie podcast. And history podcasts. Like, you came here to talk about these things.
It happened already.
It's in the past and doesn't matter. It's essentially what we're saying. We've done our lives. Speaking of this, okay, we've been heading around the block. You talk about being a pop culture historian, which means I want to ask you a whole bunch of stuff. I actually made a list, and I was writing down earlier today. I was looking at your faculty website, and I literally made this note, said, Jeff teaches some cool ass shit. So
there we go. That's that's goals met.
I love it. Like, okay, so can you talk? Okay, so for folks who are unfamiliar with your work and stuff like that, what would you say you do here?
Broadly speaking, I'm a cultural historian, but I've really mostly focused in on popular culture in my teaching and in my scholarship in the last 10 or 15 years. And what that means is that I'm studying stories, but I'm just studying stories that happen to take place in music or in film, television, and so on. And I'm interested in what those stories tell us about how we're living, what arguments we're involved in, what populations we're worried about, what populations we're embracing, and so basically it's a way of studying American history without talking about presidents or the Federal Reserve or whatever the rest of those folks out there do. And I have to say the part of my life where it matters most to me really is in my teaching, because I get to teach, like I'm currently co-teaching a class that's called Intro to Hip Hop Studies.
Oh my God.
And so it's a class, and I'm co-teaching it with a Boston rapper named Acrobatic, who's this amazing, he's been making music for 20 years. He's this amazing performer and this great teacher. And our thing is always like, we're teaching about hip hop, but we're not teaching about hip hop, because we're really teaching, about race. We're teaching about youth culture. We're teaching about Boston history. We're teaching about masculinity. You know what I mean? So it's it's always sort of like a bait and switch,
right? It's like, isn't that what hip hop does?
Yeah, that's it. The vehicle is the word. It's always like pop culture is fascinating in it of itself, and I could talk about it all day long, but it's always like, what is it telling us about the relationship of the white power structure to young Black men, right? Or it's telling us about intra-African American conversations about gender role and sexuality, whatever. Like, we can take this, like, I had a grad student come in yesterday, this guy Jack, gave a great guest lecture on blaxploitation film of the 1970s and how it constructed some narratives that hip hop really picked up on about kind of like hypermasculine Black men as a response to this kind of like white domination backlash politics of the late 60s, early 70s. And so it was just fantastic. So that's the kind of thing. I mean, I say bait and switch, but it's more like pull on the thread and see what comes, when you pull on that hip hop thread, what else comes along with it. And that's why I love, I teach a class called Social History of Popular Music. I change it up each time, but there's always some stuff about race, some stuff about technology, some stuff about urban youth culture. You know what I mean? And so it's just this way to teach broad-based, American studies, interdisciplinary classes with music as the vehicle, which is like a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, it brings students in. On the other hand, they really have very fully formed priors on the material, right? And it's sometimes hard to say to them, okay, but now we're thinking about this in a new kind of scholarly analytic frame. And you want to say, I promise it's going to enhance your listening. Ultimately, it's going to bum you out for a few months, and then it's going to open stuff up for you that you hadn't really thought about or had access to before.
No, like every good historian, your job first and foremost is to ruin the fun of whatever it is that you're doing, and then people
and then say you had no idea how good the party could be. Like, you didn't even know.
I'll tell you, like, you're talking, I'm like, can Jeff be on every podcast? Because like I feel like, well, so I see you tweeting. So people know that you're on Twitter and stuff like that. And you and I are always yelling at each other and stuff like that. I always see you talking about music or pop culture stuff like that. And of course, this whole HATM experiment happened not because I'm a pop culture historian. I'm kind of coming in late to that. I'm a pop culture historian for like 4 years, entirely on accident. But the thing that I've come to realize is exactly what you're saying, which is it's like there's so much history embedded in pop culture, and so much of what your quote average person who non-scholar, I never know the right word here, comes to understand about the past through pop culture far more than any number of the books that we read, right? That's the reason why some films can be really, really dangerous. I think we always talk about, say, like Gone with the Wind as being a super dangerous film. Birth of a Nation, obviously, but even in the more modern time, I've been arguing recently about how Red Dawn, I think, is the most dangerous film of the recent past. I think, it's a terrifying film.
Yeah.
How do you design a class like that? Do you just have like this thought while you're in the kitchen washing dishes or just out for a run? Or I was looking at your courses and I was like, what is course design like? And I want to like expose like the art of historian, if you will, to like folks. Like,
I love that.
How do you think about like a course?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm going to go way back here. In the mid 90s, I was teaching at Trinity College, and I proposed and got accepted to teach a whole class just on Elvis. And I was like, there was a real scholarly Elvis boom happening right there. So that was part of where I was coming from. Is there's plenty of materials, like I'm going to have stuff to work with. But then I was like, you call a class Elvis, and right away you're teaching the class about post-war Southern history. You're teaching a class about poor white culture and history. You're teaching a class about white adaptations, or if you want to use the current phrase, cultural appropriation of Black musical stuff. You're talking about gender and sexuality in a number of different ways, right? There's Elvis is just how he moved on stage. There's his relationship with underage Priscilla and what that told us about kind of male privilege and post-war culture. You're talking about Cold War culture more, in the most general way. So I started thinking about it saying like, okay, what are like 6 or 8, like anybody, any class you're putting together, what are 6 or 8 units that like I can organize thematically, have some music, have some film, have some reading. And it's not that different from any other, then classes I was teaching on, in legal history or in African-American studies, which was the sort of core of what I was doing back then. So that was the thing to me about Elvis. It was just sort of like, again, I'm going to say like Elvis is this thread and we pull on it and you're like, oh, right, this is going to bring along with it like stuff about drag culture, because Elvis is, buddying up with Little Richard and pulling stuff from Little Richard's time in drag bars in Alabama. Like there's just all this stuff that you don't think right away when you think Elvis, but you used the word earlier. He's a vehicle, and he's one of the best vehicles that there is. There's very few places that you can't get on the Elvis train, and it's that's one of the reasons I love it. A lot of it is really just kind of, you kind of toss the ball in the air and hope somebody hits it, because it's like you don't always know if it's going to, like if this stuff's going to land, if it's going to make sense the way it did in your head when you were washing dishes or, out for a run or whatever. But I always, so that was where I started. And then more recently, since I'm in Boston, a lot of my classes have been, who can I get to come in? Like, who can I get, who's a
people out there.
Exactly. And it's amazing. And so I've been teaching this social history popular music class, and that very much what I've done is first figure out what guests can I get, because I want to leave the stage a decent amount. I want to have people who are speaking from experience, speaking from decades of being in the fray, talking about what it means to be a woman in punk rock, right? So you've got, I got Talia Zedek, who's been making music for, literally 50 years, and still doing it, really loud, abrasive, scary music. And she's like the nicest person, and so very often I'm just thinking, who can I bring to students who will make them think about their own place in the world and how they read the world? Like, that's always my thing. It's like, I want them to leave the class feeling like they can read the world. I don't care if they read this particular novel or that particular, academic essay. I just want them to think like, oh, like I just heard it, like Blink's making a reunion album. I'm ready. I'm going to be able to read that, I'm listening to trap music because that's my jam. That's what I like to dance to. And this is one of the things acrobatic is always great about bringing to students. He's like, you can dance to it and think about it. They're not mutually exclusive activities. In fact, you might do some of your best thinking when you're dancing, and wondering why I keep hearing this particular phrase or this sound effect or this trope, to use the academic word. And that's the thing, like for us, is like teaching pop culture, it's always going to be accessible. The hard part is sort of taking it to the next level of saying, what's the historical context I need to know, right? Like what's the, we talk a lot about, sort of Black, HBCU culture, step culture, just sort of what are some of that, the dozens, what are some of the antecedents of hip hop that you need to know if you want to fully understand the music? And that's like, that to me is the course design kind of follows, asking some basic questions. Where did this come from? What does it argue? What does it do in the world? Who hates it? Like, that's always a big one for us. Who hates this?
Oh, that's
and what
great.
what does that tell us? Right. Like anti-fandom is a huge kind of framework in popular culture studies now. And if you look at like people freaking out about Britney Spears in 2010, and it's like, what are they freaking out about? Like, is it something about mental illness? Is it something about women's sexuality, young women's sexuality? What's the stew that's making ministers and politicians and, just suburban, woman on the street getting interviewed? Like, why are they freaking out about Britney Spears? Like, and then you have this text that's just like, whoa, like, that it just unravels, And
see, I'm already writing the term paper in my head right now. It's called "How You Remind Me," the Nickelback conundrum in 2023.
Oh yeah. There you go. There you go.
I actually saw Lizzo like on social media last night. Like, I don't understand why people don't like Nickelback. They're great, and I was like, she's right. They're a perfectly fine rock band. I don't look at Nickelback like I look at Zeppelin. If I want something loud that sounds okay and it's fun, cool. And it was weird because in my own time, I'm a little bit younger than you. In high school, there was this and just into college, there was this incredible pushback against Hootie. I remember, and again, another pop rock band, It's like, oh, we're going to hate on them. You know, not the issue there was different than say against Britney and so forth. But you know, that
I was just tweeting about Hootie last night.
Were you really?
Yeah. Well, I was listening to a bunch of like what people call bro country now, which is what Darius Rucker has become in his wonderful second career. So he's a guy who keeps walking into spaces that he quote doesn't belong in.
It's brilliant,
right?
Actually.
Like,
right, yeah.
And he's amazing. And he's this black guy who first was like, I can be like a dumb rock bro, and then he was like, okay, I did that. I can be a dumb country bro, you know, like, and he's top of the game at both. Like,
I can go to the bank is what he can do.
Exactly. And then there's that question, like, so with students, if we were talking about someone like Darius Rucker, like one of my interests would be absolutely like, why don't we expect a black guy to make rock music? Or why don't we expect a black, like country music's roots are all in, or not all, but hugely in black musical forms. Like how did that become so bizarre to us? And it's changing right now. There are a bunch of black people in country music, obviously Lil Nas X, and, you know, but it's fascinating to track like how that became this like cultural convention that we are in the process of undoing, you know, and I love that. I love that stuff.
I wonder if there's like this transition from like race to class or something like that. You know, country music's always been rooted in the impoverished. And that is not exclusive to poor white people in the South, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, you can have anybody be poor and experience those questions of like, where is home, or being tied to the land. You know,
absolutely.
That is another, you know, I'm thinking like there's this great song by Alabama in the early 90s called Song of the South, right? Which is talking about oppression and all these kinds of things, you know, and being tied to the land can be found in indigenous music. Obviously it can be found in hip hop, you know, the land can be Detroit. The land can be the dirty South, right? It's like, oh my God, all these roots, when you start breaking them down, like we're just finding different ways to sing about the same themes.
Yep.
You know, it's like,
absolutely. And I love finding those kind of places where people cross who like aren't supposed to cross, aren't supposed to know each other.
That's why
share
Nas
cultural
X,
stuff.
like makes so much sense. It's like he shows up and you're like, oh, you're welcome here because we've been on the same team the whole damn time.
Exactly. And that's why, I mean, this is just shoot from the hip. It's one of the reasons I think why little kids love him, because it's just little kids love when you're like, what else can we throw in here? Like, you know, like when the kids bake, they want to throw like all the colors, you know, and like that's Lil Nas X. He's just like a little hip hop beat, a little country thematics, some queer, you know, queer stuff. Like
he's so
like relatable. He's got it all.
It's and he's got this super inviting, like I see this guy and I'm like, this guy's got a smile on his face. I want to be around people who do that.
Absolutely. And he's bringing it to, I mean, and that's it. Like when you see someone who's reaching that kind of multi-generational, cross-race, cross-class crowd, then you sort of say, what usually keeps us from that? You know, like what are the marketing forces? What are the political forces that sort of keep us from? Some of it's just straight up industry. Like they have these charts, like urban is for black people, country's for white people, you know, like, and we follow it. We're good rule followers, bad rule followers, you know? And absolutely. I love those moments when people kind of crash through the wall and it's like, you know, triumphantly like, hey, here I am.
Well, I want to ask you about something divisive.
Bring it.
Coke versus Pepsi. What you got?
Oh, see, yeah, I have a little, I know our listeners aren't going to be able to hear this, but I got something really important here.
Okay.
Which is it's from the 1980s. It's called Pepsi Light.
What is that?
It's got a little lemon in it. And I feel like that was the road that we should have gone down. Like so I don't want to get caught up in this Coke Pepsi binary. What I want to suggest is we forgot the fruit. You know, like I think there was Pepsi Light, there was a little lemon. I know we had our cherry Coke moment, but like what I want to say is we missed the opportunity to like bring cola to the nation's youth as a healthy drink with a little fruit in it, you know? And so that's where I want to put my flag down is that we need to bring the fruit back to cola.
I saw the other day, like there was a friend of mine sent me an image of a Peeps flavored Pepsi or something like that.
Wow. See, that's very imaginative.
Just going full diabetes. Like, let's just
exactly like one drink and you're done.
Go to the doctor as you're drinking this right now. And it's not like the Coca-Cola that I'm drinking. I am so begging for them to. You know what? If Pepsi wants to sponsor this, I will switch. I'm a loyalist, but man, I can be corrupted.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll just say
absolutely. I think it's time to monetize this. Yeah, absolutely.
Without a doubt. Like I'll move to Charlotte. Like let's go. You know, or Dr. Pepper if they want me to come out to Texas. Yeah, I'll blend in. You know,
yeah. You could
like show up, so I'm making fun of their barbecue. Look, y'all are doing that wrong, and there should be beans in this chili. I'm just saying. Right. So
it's time. It's time.
I'll get myself in trouble. All right, let's talk about. Speaking of time, we're like 20 minutes into this pod. We haven't even talked about the movie yet, which is awesome. Let's talk about Great Segues by Jason. You are now listening to Jason and Jeff and our music sidekick. All right, so all I wanted to do, I didn't even know about a movie to talk to you about. Like, I come to you, I was like, I just want to hang out with you because you and I've been talking for years, and it's like I felt like, all right, I'm not getting up to Cambridge anytime soon. Let's just hang out. So it's like, what do we watch? And
Appreciate it.
Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. So why are we watching Once Upon a Time in Hollywood? Why are we talking about this movie? What about this movie does it for you?
Great. So, I mean, the easy answer is I'm a guy who wrote a book about the Manson family, and this is a movie that's,
All right, go on.
So at least, so the movie is at least, a little bit obsessed with sorting through who the Manson family was and what they did in and to Los Angeles in 1968 and 1969. And it's Quentin Tarantino. And like my starting point here is this great line that the novelist Zachary Lazar said in his novel Sway, which is partly about the Manson family too. And he was like, at this point, the Manson family is contemporary folklore. Mm-hmm. It's not history anymore. It's in the realm of scary stories we tell to get, shivers in the dark and to score certain political points. But we're the whole question of accuracy. Like, that's one of the things, like, I don't care about accuracy. Like, that's not what I'm here for. I'm not here to talk about how Quentin Tarantino got it wrong in terms of facts. I have some things to say about how he got it wrong in terms of politics. But so I want to start from that place that Quentin Tarantino loves some good folklore. Like, he loves a story where you make, a movie about the Nazis, but, Jews kind of do okay. Like it's kind of like the flip side of Schindler's List. It's like a Holocaust movie, but the Jews live, and so Tarantino's great for that, for taking like these kind of iconic stories and turning them into something they weren't and couldn't have been.
He's got a fascination with the past. I think we think about Tarantino and think about maybe the stylish guy who loves the F word and like, right. Makes these really, watchable films. I think I've seen everything he's ever done. I've got my favorite. It's Reservoir Dogs.
Right, Jump Street. You're a Jump Street guy, right? Right out the gate.
God,
that was a strong movie.
Oh, so good. I tip though. I was wanted to ask you because he does all, a lot of what we can say is that he does like these counterfactuals. And can we use these things? I mean, to talk about the past, or do you feel like they're a good narrative device, a vehicle to maybe talk about?
That's great. I mean, that's a great question. And like, my brain almost like shut down there because it is counterfactual. Absolutely. Except like when you're watching this movie in particular, like so much about it is incredibly factual. Right. Like, he's got those driving scenes, and he loves Los Angeles, and I do too. I just want to say I'm an East Coast guy who loves LA, love the landscape, love the old space age diner signs, and like he wants you to see every fucking movie marquee, he gets exactly right the place where Sharon Tate had her last lunch. Like, it's El Coyote. Like, he wants you to know that he's in this lore. Like, he knows this stuff. He wants to represent it really accurately. But then there's this story he tells, which is the biggest. And here's right. Batshit crazy, I think, is the technical term we historians use. Yeah. And he tells you this story, which is this unbelievable fantasy about Sharon Tate, which is that she, and here's the big spoiler, people so quickly turn off if you haven't seen the movie yet, is that she doesn't die. And it's like this fantasy. It's like the Manson family version of Schindler's List. Like Sharon Tate did die. She got horribly murdered,
and her child, right,
and her and her 5 friends who were like, she got horribly disfigured, murdered, terribly,
in the worst way.
But in the worst way, and he wants us not only to imagine it didn't happen, to engage that fantasy, but then to like do some real cultural work with it, because like it's not just that the Mansons are bad guys. Like, the Manson family, they're bad guys. Like, there's no question there, but the way he neutralizes them in the movie is so over the top. And I'll just sort of jump to the, my it's not such a huge observation, but literally the flamethrower, that takes care of the last Manson girl is the same flamethrower that the actor used to kill Nazis in the movie that we see him filming early on. Right. So there's this kind of like homologous structure in the movie that like these bad hippies are sort of the Nazis of the current, moment. And like, the Manson family were a lot of kinds of bad guys. They were a lot of kind of bad guys, but they were not Nazis. They were not like or, you know, running the state fascists. They were this very marginal group that like did some really bad shit for a couple weeks, but that a couple nights really. I mean, they did some other bad shit, but the kind of over the, and I know this is kind of ridiculous to say about Tarantino, like, because over the top violence it's like saying, you know, like Martin Scorsese has a lot of good music in his movies. Like it's just normative. It's not like an observation or an insight. But just like the castration of Tex Watson by the dog and the flamethrower of the, you know, the one woman from the burning up of the one woman from the Manson family. It's just like he wants you to think like the real counterfactual he wants you to think is that the Manson family were like a real threat to, you know, good civilians in Los Angeles. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely does.
Yeah, I mean, so that's where the movie really freaks me out is, and then there's this like amazing reunion, sort of meeting of old Hollywood in the form of Leonardo DiCaprio's character and the new Hollywood in the form of Sharon Tate and Jay Sebring and the folks up on 10,050 Cielo Drive. And it's like, oh, these hippies came in and kind of like messed with the proper workings of life in Hollywood, but like one guy got his balls bit off, one woman got, you know, torched. We're good now, you know, like we're like as if everything was okay now, and it wasn't, you know, like so that's, I mean, that's the question I'm really interested in. Like, what is the counterfactual? Like, and the counterfactual is that the Manson family were like a bigger deal than they really were. Like they did some horrible crimes, but they didn't. All the kind of folklore we've been taught to believe about them, they weren't really trying to cook up a race war. They didn't really upset much in LA. In fact, a lot of people in LA really loved them and liked partying with them and liked having sex with them and like, you know, visiting them out at Spahn Ranch.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, what the Manson family did was sell a lot of books after the fact, right? I mean, they become, you know, so I grew up in the 80s, you know, well after this happens, right? But I'm aware of Charles Manson as a young child, but in a different context. Like, he was a name, and you would see images of him. This is, you know, obviously pre-internet in the 90s and so forth. But it was almost hard to take him seriously in some ways. And that's weird to say about a guy who is behind these horrendous murders, right? But that's kind of maybe what time does. I don't know. It was
And he was into that. I mean, he gave these interviews where he carried on and he acted, you know, purposefully crazy, I think, to use the vernacular. And I think you're absolutely right. By the 80s, he was kind of this like performance criminal, you know, like he was, I think that was Ed Sanders called him that originally, that he was just interested in like playing the bad guy, you know, but he was, I mean, insofar he was a terrible guy. He was also a guy who was incarcerated, like starting at age 12. Like, and so all these ways we currently talk about, you know, carceral personalities and the, you know, the power of the state to really shape and warp people through, you know, police practices and prison practices. Like that's Manson. Like he is like the carceral personality. And he, I don't expect that from a Quentin Tarantino movie for sure, but it is what we get about the women in this other movie that maybe we'll have time to talk about, called Charlie Says, which was made by feminists and was interested in what happens to people in prison and how radicals can try to undo some of that. But the Tarantino movie, again, it's like, it's all, I mean, it's just all shits and giggles, right? It's all.
This is like, a comedy.
It's a comedy.
This is a comedy about Charles Manson.
Manson, exactly.
And the murder of Sharon Tate, her child, and their friends.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. It's a comedy. And it's a comedy that basically is in the service of saying, you know, these young Hollywood types who are, you know, they're whatever, no judgment. They're partiers. They're kind of, you know, they're not like heavy, serious people. And then the actor and the stuntman from the old Hollywood, like, it's just sort of saying like Hollywood's good as long as you keep the bad people out. Like it's a good industry. People understand each other, you know, like we laugh at that scene where the Bruce Lee figure gets beat up, right? Because he's also an out, like, and that's just straight up racist. I think like he's an outlier because he's, you know, he's Asian and like, and I think, I mean, I'm trying to remember when I saw it in the theater, like people didn't cheer at that scene exactly, but it was like definitely, it was comedy. It was
right. Yeah. It's like a bit, right? It's like, oh, this cocky guy, you know, it's going to be our guy, right? It's going to be Brad Pitt. Speaking of Brad Pitt, like, diving off, I tend to forget anyone else is in this movie except for Pitt. You know, it's weird. He's billed second in this movie And I think that, and I was having this conversation last night. I think Brad Pitt is one of the great actors of his time. I think he's a character actor in a leading man's body. How's Brad Pitt in this movie? How do you like Brad Pitt in this movie?
Yeah, I love him, and literally, I mean, and I didn't think about this till you just kind of foregrounded his role, but he's literally playing a stunt man, and like the whole movie's a stunt. The whole movie is like what can we, can we pull this off? Like, can we like make you not exactly see what we're doing and make?
Can we make a movie about this? Yeah.
Can we make a movie about this? And that's always Tarantino, right? But Brad Pitt, I love in it because he's the one who actually has a sense of how the industry works. Mm-hmm. Like he recognizes that his job now is not really as a stuntman, that he's just kind of like the man Friday, to the Leonardo DiCaprio character. And there's he's like, I'm going to put my union hat for a second. He's got like this whole, all labor has dignity. Like, you need me to go fix your antenna on your house. That's part of my job. I got you. You need me to get you home safe when you're too drunk. Like, I got you, I'll get your boots off and everything. And I really love Brad Pitt in it because he plays it like an old-fashioned movie actor. Like everything's like right. Like he's playing it like an old Hollywood guy, like, again, as you said, like not a smooth lead man, but like this great, character actor who's seen it all. He's a little hard bitten, but he knows how to make do. I love that. He's like the journeyman guy in the movie that's mostly about prima donnas, whether it's Manson or the, Leonardo DiCaprio's character, or Sharon Tate, who literally there's that unbearable to me long scene in the movie where she goes to see her own movie, in the movie theater. And it's like this great, I mean, I guess it's a great scene in a way because it's about like the narcissism of Hollywood actors who just want to, see their own reflection. But I love Brad Pitt because he's this great reminder of like, oh, this shit works because there's a crew, because there's stuntmen, because there, and it is this little bit of Tarantino kind of letting us see behind the curtain, which I definitely appreciate in the movie. Yeah.
I mean, he wins the Oscar for this. He's so much fun. I too, I was saying earlier, I'm wearing this Disney shirt. I too am wearing the yellow shirt. He wears that, Valvoline shirt with the that's like, it's one of his
yes.
In my mind's eye, I imagine Pitt now in like that look. And he just completely sells it. I hope he'll do okay for the rest of his career. I just, he seems like he's got a nice future ahead of him.
He's a guy who could just, he works, if you think about the range of directors he works with too, it's like the Tarantino, the Coen brother, like he's just like, he can swing anything with some real weird dude. Yeah. Yeah.
Shows up in 12 Years a Slave, for 5 minutes.
Right. He does. I forgot about that. See, that's classic. He just sort of disappears into that. Yeah. Yeah.
He has that ability. And I think it's crazy because, when I watch Clooney, as much as I love Clooney, I know I'm watching Clooney.
Absolutely. And you love it. Like the way you watch Cary Grant, like it's just like Clooney's got that, like he's just so charming. You'll watch him and whatever, but he doesn't exactly disappear that way. Yeah.
No, but there are some guys, and I think Pitt is one of those where where as hard as it is to believe, you kind of forget you're watching Pitt.
Yeah.
I mean, he's a classic actor. All right, going back to like the history bit here, like you had talked a little bit about Manson as being the product of this carceral system. We were talking about this other film. Can you talk a little bit about that and these ideas of like the system creating people or what the system does? Like, and we talk about the system, like the system is ultimately American people making choices to create laws and rules and regulations. This is humans doing this to other people.
Yep. And I'm always shocked. I mean, this was one of the things that brought me into writing a book about the Manson family is literally the only major book we have. It's not scholarly, but like the major book we have, obviously, on the Manson family is Helter Skelter, which was written by the prosecutor. And I'm always like, I see people who are at least vaguely on the left, like approvingly quoting that book. And I'm like, hey, I thought we didn't like cop narratives. I thought we didn't like, we talk about propaganda and that, right. Like how come Bugliosi gets such he just gets like a free pass to be like the good daddy who's telling us this bedtime story that's like a little scary, but he's going to set it right, and he literally, and I write about this in my book, like he literally, there's like 200 pages of Helter Skelter, and then he introduces himself when he comes into the story, and he literally starts writing like in first person, here's who I am. He tells us he's married with 2 kids, and it's like this classic, like resetting the table. And that really, when I thought about it as a, sort of grown up scholar person, I was like, why like that was a book of the month club book. Like that was, I mean, I am older than you. That was in every house I was in the 1970s. Like that was just everywhere. I read it. There was a mini series made from it that we all watched over, And that's really the only narrative we have in the Manson family, that he was this feral hippie who wanted to inspire a race war. And it's like, I went back and I was like, well, there was good reasons to worry about race war in the late 1960s, but it was not Charles Manson, right? No. It was the Watts riot in 1965. It was Detroit, it was Newark.
Hundreds of years of oppression of people. Yeah.
Right. It was the Vietnam War, which is also a racist imperialist. And it's like, and that amazing bait and switch was like, really? Manson is who we're worried about? Like, right. This guy out in an abandoned film ranch, like where they used to film Western TV, shows, and a couple of Western themed porn movies also. He's marginal. He's nothing. And
he's the shiny object.
The fact that he's the shiny object. And it's like, why do we love, we keep picking it up and be like, ooh, scary hippie, and again, I'm old enough to remember scary hippies a little bit. And the idea that the kind of peace and love aspect of hippie culture was underwritten by this dark side, and it clearly came out in the Hells Angels, and the role they played at that Stones concert in late '69, and so there's ways that things lined up that we were ready for a cultural reset, but Manson then becomes it. He's the shiny object, the poster child, the scary hippie, and he wasn't a hippie. He was too old. He always said my culture was Bing Crosby. He's he's a guy who came of age in the 50s. He was born in the 30s. You know what I mean? He liked being around the young women hippies, but he was not of that culture in any meaningful way.
I'm wondering, I'm going to take a leap here. And I wonder if maybe if I go way off base, you can correct me here. But, we're talking about Manson and this idea of what he represents as this tool that people use to say, this is what's causing societal decay. And right now, I can't help but think here in Florida, governor is about to sign legislation banning pride and drag activities, I believe, tonight. I'm wondering is there a correlation here between the current maybe political climate using anti-LGBTQ as this false narrative? To
absolutely.
Does that seem to be the shiny object?
Yeah. I mean, that's a great question, and my mind wants to go two places, maybe related, which is the academic frame I'd use there is that it's absolutely what we call a moral panic, right? Is that you find an other to point to that will explain everything that's wrong in the culture, particularly what's wrong with young people. Right. So in the 80s, you had the whole daycare moral panic that there were that somehow there was an epidemic of not just sexual abuse, but really bizarre occult sexual abuse. And clearly there was a narrative in there about why are all these kids in daycare? Why aren't they home with their moms? There was that kind of anti-woman backlash. And I think the thing right now about the anti-LGBT Q moral panic that lines up very interestingly with the Manson moment is that we're looking for ways to explain how the family has been reorganized in recent history. And in the Manson moment, it's no-fault divorce. It's obviously women's liberation, second-wave feminism, women demanding to have jobs outside the home back since after the backlash of the post-World War II era. Children, young people demanding rights, speaking up against the war, joining civil rights, right? And there's this huge runaway crisis, right? There's all these particularly young women who are running away in the mid to late 60s from abusive or neglectful families, and they join this new family, the Manson family. So there's all this talk about where's dad? Where's the kind of iron hand of dad running the household? How Art Linkletter, released a 45 of him, talking to his runaway daughter, come home, we love you, and trying to reassert that kind of patriarchal nuclear family vibe that clearly had passed, or if it ever existed. So it's fascinating to me because I think we're similarly in a moment now where there's been this amazing decade long or more challenge to what we thought, the standard family looked like. It freaks out conservatives and they're looking for a villain to explain it. Now it's drag queens telling stories. It's right. No, it's your dystopian, dysfunctional nuclear family that's sending your kids looking for new ways of being, right? Like that idea that the nuclear family is the answer to anything is, I mean, that was a very brief experiment in U.S. history, right? The nuclear family that lived alone, right? Like that was a couple decades, didn't work. Like many of us have lived that ourselves. We know that didn't work. We need broader, more extended family networks. There was this amazing, quick tangent, and I'll hope that I answer your question. There was this amazing White House special commission on the family that was convened right around the same time as the Manson moment. And it was all these people brought in, including wonderfully Mr. Rogers was a part of it. And they wrote this report that, among other things, just said, we have to recognize that there's a lot of ways to be a family. It could be one parent. It could be, it could be multi-generational. And they argued for like these things that today would seem so utopian to us. Like we need to have basically what now we call like wraparound school districts. Like around the school, there need to also be health clinics, after school care, elder care. And they just had this idea that like,
protect
right,
society,
nuclear family can't, yeah, exactly. Like build a healthy society. And of course, none of the recommendations were adopted, and it didn't go anywhere. But it was really, it was stunning that in this moment, people were like looking at things like the Manson family and saying, right, this is a symptom. We need to address what's the root cause of the symptom. We don't need to pretend. We can't pretend like the symptom is the problem, right? So like the Manson family, like gets presented as a problem all the time, but clearly like Manson was successful because he was really good at making young women feel listened to, cared for. And that's the piece we've missed, I think, or sort of that's the kind of like cultural blinders we have, that we can't see that his family was appealing, like a lot of communes, because it presented a better way of living. There's a great novel that Emma Klein wrote called The Girls, which is about the women of the Manson family. And like her basic insight is that the women joined this family for each other, not for Charlie. Because like they had this amazing network of women, friends, sisters, whatever you want to call them. And they were in the kitchen together, at least. They were still doing the cooking, but at least they had a big crowd. They were singing, they're smoking some weed. They were doing some
of women.
It's at like a really well-functioning, high-functioning one. Yeah, yeah. So that's where, I think you're absolutely right. And I hesitate sometimes to make, sort of like historical contemporary world connections, but that one really rings true for me because I do think we're in the middle of a moral panic. Usually moral panics grow a little bit more organically. Like this one is so stage managed by very powerful and well-resourced, agents, right? This is right-wing money, and they know what they're doing, and they have a game plan, right? And we find, occasionally we find the memos where they admit, like we're gonna go after the drag queens, or we're gonna go after librarians. Like go after librarians, man. What are you nuts? Like, but that's the moral panic is. What happened to the family? Like what happened to patriarchal authority, right? What happened to daddy? Where's daddy? Like, yeah.
Resistance of change. And this idea, it's golly, it's almost like God, I don't want to turn this into a super political podcast, but God, I almost feel like, trickle down economics works in your mind. The nuclear family works in this utopian idea in your head. It's like, of course that sounds great. It's not reality. And right. You've got to be, open to change, open to different things.
And I'm like the last guy in the world to talk about economics because I don't understand it. But like I do know that since 2008 and the horrible recession that year, this has all intensified, right? Like it used to be that if there was one good union job in the family, you could live on that, and you can't. And first of all, like how many good union jobs are there? And second, nobody's living on one income anymore, given the the rate of inflation and the rising housing costs and all that. So anyway, that's sort of far afield, but it is, a lot of this is about family to me, and what's like the proper family. And in Tarantino's movie, just to go back to that for a second, like the Manson family is just. It's not just that they're dysfunctional. They're like the worst nuclear family. There's nothing good about what's happening there. And meanwhile, we have plenty of good, on the ground reporting, memoir saying what was going on at Spahn Ranch was really appealing to a lot of people, right? Mm. Like, so when Brad Pitt's character goes out there and beats hell out of one of the Manson family, that's not, again, I don't care about historical accuracy, but I do care about the arguments that the counterfactual cooks up. And in that case, it's like, no, these guys, like Dennis Wilson from the Beach Boys, he was going out to Spahn Ranch because he loved that scene, Like he was having sex with young women, possibly what we would now call underage young women. But he was really, they came and lived at his house for a while, a bunch of the Manson women. Like he and Terry Melcher, these guys, they loved the scene. Like this to them was like, this was like, forget about women's liberation. This was the male liberation dream, like unfettered access to all kinds of young women and drugs. And yeah.
See, this is where I think there's a brilliance in doing something that's so far afield. We know that Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is fiction, right? We know this. So we can take these moments that are clearly fictional and really kind of illustrate the larger realities. Say, better than, say, a movie like Braveheart, which is supposedly based on reality, but it's so bad at being accurate that you can't really take anything else going on at its word. Am I right?
Right.
I mean, that's kind of the brilliant counterfactuals. There was a pushback. There was a show, I don't know if you recall this, the makers of Game of Thrones a few years ago were going to make a series, I believe, on what would have happened, say, if the South had won the Civil War. And I remember seeing there was a great big debate amongst historians on Twitter and outrage about this idea. Are we fetishizing black oppressment, things like that? I remember looking back and questioning, did they lose the Civil War? Because I look around and see so much of the aims of people who were committed to keeping African Americans, people of color, not just African Americans, in states of oppression, and it's 2023. So I kind of wonder, if you create something like that, and again, I know you've got to be careful with this because no one wants to fetishize, and I'm wary. Yes, I come from a poor family, but I come from a poor white family. I cannot understand. I do not have that ability. All I can do is empathize with with a person of color whose ancestors were, enslaved. But I wonder if you can take these counterfactuals and say, wait a second. Don't you see that in this case where the South had won the war, there are these real similarities to what's happening now? I don't know.
I mean, that's amazing. That's the dream of what we use fantasy for, right? We use fantasy to like help ourselves frame, quote, real world, power relations, power dynamics. And that's amazing. And I think like that would be I'm trying to create the list in my head now of things that I think, have done that, successfully. But like you think about, like whatever your favorite space opera, whatever, like if you're a Star Wars guy or a Star Trek guy, like either way, you can find things within those fantasies that are directly mappable onto their like, Absolutely. I mean, I know Star Trek a little bit better, but like, you just think about the kind of multiracial, gender integrated, aspect of that first ship. And it's like, okay, it's weak tea, but it's some kind of tea that is clearly like, it's some kind of civil rights document, right? Like it's impossible to think about it outside of that, right? Or you mentioned aliens before, and I'm thinking about the power of Sigourney Weaver, like having that shot, like somebody wanted to say something about strong mothers, and like, and I just like fantasy. So like I don't know much about fantasy narratives, or but in this case we're thinking about Tarantino. Like the counterfactual could have been about the marginalization of young people, and the way that the older generation was freaked out about young people expressing their power, right? But it went completely the other way, right? And it said, oh, the young people are getting out of line. We literally need to torch them, like, and so I guess that's my thing is like, not only do I not care about accuracy in film or in other, in other visual narratives, but I'm like, okay, what are you doing with it? Like whose water are you carrying? Right. And it's like you said, like, we don't need a counterfactual about the South winning because we're in the middle of voting rights being rolled back, and we're in the right, like we're living this horrible return to the immediate post-Reconstruction era, right? And it's like, so if you're making that film on some level, you have to say, who's this for? Like, who's this right? Like, who's this serving? Who's going to like, you can't predict how audiences will use your work, but it's like, sometimes you can, like sometimes you can. And that's like, there's all these, this is one thing, it's like a cliche to say in pop culture study, but like, there's all these sitcoms in the 1950s that are about nuclear families. Dad goes out and works. Like literally one of the good books on that era of sitcoms is called Honey, I'm Home. Right. And like, that's the like narrative that powerful people really wanted to present in the 1950s was like, we're back, we're good. Daddy's out at work, mom's home. We had this brief period where mom had to go to work. Like, I don't know if you, I mean, for you, it would probably be like grandparent generation, but I had like, or maybe great grandparent, but I had like an old aunt who told me about her work life during World War II. And it's a narrative that is otherwise completely invisible to me. I'm like, you were what? You were a chemist? What were you working on? You're just Aunt Thelma. Like you were home with the kid. Like, and she talks to me, and I know this is sort of standard in the historical narrative about what she lost in those years, and including that we have no representation of it. Like we don't even have a picture of what it looks like for. She was this Bronx Jewish woman working in some chemistry lab because she was smart and right. And so I guess what I want to say back to that counterfactual question is like, what narratives do we promote? Like, what narratives do we make space for? Right. Like one of the reasons I like the movie Charlie Says so much is that it presents the Manson family as literally a working family. They're supporting themselves. They're sustaining themselves. And Charlie's pretty appealing. And like, that's not a counterfactual. That's I think a factual narrative. And I guess juxtaposing that with Tarantino, it reminds me that Tarantino, end of the day, is always going to be about kind of reassertion of a certain kind of male power and privilege, right? I don't even say that as a criticism. It's just kind of Jump Street with him. And like, this is not a moment where I have a lot of space for that kind of, you know what I'm saying? Like that's a problematic narrative in our moment. Like that's a narrative that is maybe going to do some bad work in the world or kind of support some other, bad ideas. Or again, I don't think anyone's set their clocks by Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, but it does participate in this rhetoric of like, oh man, like he's got the blood, we love that. He's got the blowtorch. He's getting things back together. He's got his, his wife safe at home, like in the bedroom, and his Italian,
Yeah, I kind of wonder, you're absolutely right. I think that you're probably in line in like another 5 or 6 years after his final film, which I think which is about to start filming now. He's filming a movie called The Critic. I think is supposed to be his last film, is what he's saying. I still want to see the Star Trek film that he's talking about doing. But I've got this whole renewed interest in Star Trek ever since Strange New Worlds come out. But that's a conversation for another. I think it's brilliant. Oh, I'm so in on this show. But I kind of wonder what happens, how Kill Bill fits into those narratives as well. Like at some point in time, like there's going to be a shit ton of classes of using Quentin Tarantino to enter into discussions of the United States or world history at some point in time.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there probably are folks doing that already in cinema studies. That's a little outside my arena, but like, absolutely. I think, and again, I think one by one, I mean, like you mentioned Reservoir Dogs early on, right? And I was thinking of I'm just going to say it, like the thrill of those around the table scenes where it was like really masculinist, obviously, but like in that way that many of us just find so like they're funny, they got nicknames, they got like it's this kind of, it was like this return to this kind of 30s 40s gangster culture that like really let you think about some of the good stuff. These were guys, they were funny, they were relating, they were incredibly, like their verbal dexterity was like really admirable.
This is how men should perform around other men. It's like at least that's what Tarantino's kind of saying. There's an aspirational quality to that, and certainly for me, Reservoir Dogs comes out 96-ish. I can't. Maybe a little earlier. I can't recall. I'm in high school, and I'm like, oh, okay, cool. This in Reservoir Dogs feels like a stage play as well to me. But
absolutely,
I think it's a brilliant film.
I don't have the years down, but like if you put a gun to my head and say Reservoir Dogs or Fight Club, I'm definitely going to take Reservoir Dogs, right? Like which are the kind of in my mind anyway, the kind of paired talky male violent movies of that moment. And that's the thing about Tarantino is that he knows he's not a macho man. Like he knows that these are social constructions, that like men shouldn't really be like this. But it's like, what do we want from men in the movies, right? Like, and Reservoir Dogs was like, we want guys in suits who talk funny and have big guns. And like, that's a very old, familiar formation in American film, right? It's like Jimmy Cagney, like, is the king of that in the 1930s, right? Because then you see him in other movies and he's a great dancer. And it's like, right? Like a man should also be a great dancer, right? Like
these are the traits that a man should carry.
Right.
I want to ask you about this because Tarantino, maybe more than any filmmaker I can think of in our age right now, seems to be fascinated with the 1970s. I mean, obviously, this takes place a little bit earlier. We'll call it the long 70s.
Yeah.
Why the 70s? Is this just the fact that was his era that he grew up in, and that's what he? Because I don't see anyone else really talking about the 70s right now. What to your students is the 1970s? Is
That's a
there
great
any
question.
understanding of like what this seems such a weird decade, man.
Yes, weird is the key word. And I think, I mean, I'll answer it by not answering it, which is, so always the historian's right and privilege, right? But it's the biggest thing about the 70s is that it's not the 60s, right? And so the Manson narrative, again and again, everyone quotes the same line from Joan Didion. That night in August, when we heard the news about Sharon Tate, is when the 60s ended. Right. And I'm like, well, it was August 1969. It was going to end pretty soon anyway.
Yeah,
I don't mean to be a dick about it, but like we're 3 months out. Right. But there's this whole narrative that's developed that like somehow this was like the reboot that was necessary because things had gone too far. Right. And so 70s, if you think about it, and this is glib, but I'm just going to say it. But like if you think about the 70s as really being meaningfully characterized by a few different kinds of reaction. Right. Like, so it's reaction to the civil rights movement, reaction to women's liberation, reaction to the kind of new visibility of Black people, not just politically, but culturally. Right. And so then there's these, I was thinking about this. I mentioned blaxploitation movies. There's these blaxploitation movies that are like, they're really pro-cop, a lot of them in a weird way. And sometimes it's Black cops, and it's like, there's all these kinds of reactions. So,
right now, right? But yeah.
Right. Yeah. So Manson is like, he's the excuse to kind of say no and return, right? Like there's all these, I have all this stuff in my book about all these like Hollywood people, music industry people who are like, no more hitchhikers. I'm not picking up hitchhikers anymore. That shit's over. Right. And it's this like the 70s then, it becomes the horrible, the 60s is the shot and the 70s is the counter shot. And it's like, we're not messing with hippies anymore. Hippies are cults. Now hippies, the only way we know them is that they're scary, murderous cult people. Right. And so there's all these movies in the early 70s, and I talk about it in the book, horror movies, where the bad guy's a hippie or like something like a hippie, and they're doing home invasions like Manson did, and they're messing with the family. And most of them are too pulpy B movie to even name, but like that to me is one of the things to track in the 70s, how much reaction there is. There's what Matt Jacobson has written about this book on the ethnic revivals of the 1970s. His book's called Roots 2, and it's like white people, Italians, Jews, Greeks, being like, wait, Black people have roots? Like I got roots. Like I'm gonna organize my identity now around that I'm Italian American, or that my synagogue also has a pool, and it's like it's a Jewish community center, not just a synagogue, and like this whole like return to these more kind of tribalized identities, I think really is a reaction against the kind of utopian 60s idea that we could be like a bigger community, the beloved community of the civil rights movement, or the just kind of like Woodstock, rock festival, bigger community. Right. And that then becomes really suspect. And there's this real, like I think about it just even in my own growing up time, this real privatization of the family, privatization of home life, and that, again, privatization of domestic labor. You don't have these big extended. So anyway, that to me is where I want to start thinking about the 70s. It's literally the time after the 60s when there's a kind of renunciation of a lot of the gains of the 60s. I've been here. Yeah, I mean, the thing I'm working on now is this book about Boston music from the 70s through the 90s. And Boston is like the heart of reaction in the 1970s.
Really?
In the North. I mean, because that's where 1974 is when the school desegregation order goes into effect. And literally white people are lining the streets, throwing rocks at buses of Black kids. And, so.
Boy, does that ever challenge narratives of the South?
Yeah. I worked on a documentary recently about that desegregation moment. And I tried to get the filmmaker to call it Up South, because that's something that people sometimes say about Boston, which I kind of don't like also because it's too limiting about the South, because the South is not a monolith either. But that to me is a lot of, and I'm not saying that Manson did all this or even a lot of it, but it gave this occasion to just sort of say like that kind of cultural mixing, that kind of lack of nuclear family, patriarchal authority, like we need to like get that back a little bit, And so like, strangely enough, it happens in places you wouldn't expect, like Sesame Street, the first season. There's like this real mommy, daddy, two kids vibe of it. Like it really is part of the, I don't want to say part of the reaction, but part of the reorganization, right? And that to me is where the Manson family is the big scary, monster under the bed, right? Because it's like your kid could run away and join a cult, like. And I knew people who, in the 70s, like I was born in 64. I knew people in the 70s who joined like the Moon family cult, and had to be, deprogrammed,
right.
Right. They were brainwashed. And that's like that model of brainwashing, I think, is really important to think about the backlash against the 60s. It wasn't like people kind of consciously took on new identities or developed new political beliefs. It's like they lost their minds, they were brainwashed, and we need to deprogram them. And that's wild stuff. That's one model of cultural development that is very kind of panic-based and anti-evolution and anti-change. And so the 70s, there's so much of that. There's the whole, blanking on the guy's name, and I feel really bad because he's a Twitter buddy, but the guy who wrote a book about stranger danger in the 70s. The idea that kids were being kidnapped constantly, which didn't really happen that much. But again, it was about not letting your kids have such free range, in the neighborhood, in parks, going to school. So I just see a lot of that, and I'm probably overstating a little bit for my purposes, but I just really, I really think a lot of that was backlash against the Manson family and the lessons of the Manson family. So that's where Tarantino comes in. He was like, it didn't happen. Everything's okay. You can come have a cocktail at our house. All is well. Yeah.
I'm wondering if maybe you could choose between the worst end to the 70s. Was it disco or was it the Reagan election? I mean, what finally killed the 70s?
Yeah, see, disco. I'm a big fan both musically and in scholarly sense, because disco just blows stuff open, right? Because disco is
really?
where
Talk to me.
Disco is where queer Black and brown people kind of smuggle their music into the mainstream. It gets co-opted, obviously. It's watered down.
Where does it come from?
Disco duck, and it comes from funk kind of meeting Latin music.
Really?
And it's this amazing underground thing for years. It's only really played in gay clubs in New York, London, Chicago, a couple other places. There is a real backlash to it. There's the whole famous Comiskey Park disco demolition night where they they blew up disco records. So that we talk about the end of the 60s, end of the 70s. To me, is absolutely. I mean, it's the Iran hostage crisis, right? And it's how Reagan, kind of, in his amazing, powerful, fabulous way, created a narrative that like he was the only one. And we have the stuff that's come out recently that like Carter was making progress, and Reagan people kind of blocked it to help him win the election.
Absolutely, they did.
So that's where I'd go, with that. The disco thing, like musically, I can understand whatever taste is taste, you can like it or not. But disco,
it's an easy,
then,
yeah.
And then disco is, the first hip hop records are basically just disco records with rap, with chanting over them. Like, so Cheek's Good Times becomes the basis of, Sugar Hill Gang's Rapper's Delight. And so disco goes all kinds of interesting ways, doesn't just stay, queer, obviously goes into, I can remember suburban heterosexual couples, friends of my parents, taking disco dancing lessons, and it got quickly commodified and kind of watered down in a lot of ways. But there was a lot of interesting stuff there. The Reagan thing, I think you're absolutely right. Like, he comes in, and it's not just a different. You said trickle down before. It's not just the economic thing. It's not just some different political ideas. It is a cultural. It is and Reagan. So anyway, I'm going to bring this back to Manson, because there's a TV show that the guy David Duchovny was in, the guy from the X-Files.
Really?
And it was called Aquarius, and it's about LA in these years. And Jason, you're not going to believe me, but it's freaking great. And it's not really great, but it's fascinating. It's like like people always say, like, oh, like really good car wreck can be something really cool to look at. This is a really good car wreck because it tries to get all the LA stuff in, including that Reagan's governor, of California, for a lot of these years. He's cracking down on student protest. He's cracking down on Black Panther activity, right? So he's the reaction in the late 60s locally that then he is able to kind of deploy nationally, right? So he's breaking up the unions. He's talking about welfare queens. So he's undoing the advances of the, some of the advances of the civil rights era, right? But he does all his practice for that in California in the 1960s, right? It's the student protests at Berkeley that send him around the bend. He can't believe these snot-nosed kids think they get to have an opinion about Vietnam or about free speech, So I think Reagan is the thread that connects like the 60s California moment to the late 70s, early 80s national moment. And the show Aquarius, I swear to you, give it a try, because it really tries to get this all together as California being kind of like the laboratory in good ways, like the, kind of anti-authoritarian, Black liberation movement, but also in the bad ways, because there's all these perverse, corrupt, it's counterfactual. Like it's these perverse money Republicans who are involved with pedophile. I mean, it's great. I mean, it's really, it puts out some counterfactuals that are, I think, a little more progressive and fun to think about than the Tarantino ones.
I want to ask you about something Tarantino related. And I kind of hit you on this with an email on this a little bit earlier, because Tarantino's famous for his use of music. I discovered a lot of stuff through Tarantino films. I can't hear Stuck in the Middle with You without thinking of the scene from Reservoir Dogs. I mean, that's permanently ingrained in my head. But I don't want to focus on this particular film. But I see you posting about music all the time. On occasion, I'll post about, this, that, or the other that I like. But I defer to you a lot on musical taste. Best 3 soundtracks in film. What do you got?
Oh, that's a great question. Best 3 soundtracks in film. See, my mind right away was like, oh God, I need a taxonomy. Are we talking about films about music? Because then then we have a thumb.
You think about a movie, it's got a kick-ass soundtrack that you're like, God damn, I love the music to this movie. That the music drives. It doesn't have to be a movie about music. Music, so much as we've been talking earlier today, is a vehicle to tell stories and so forth. And obviously, music deployed well in a film helps to change the emotional tone, tell the story itself, whatever. But there are times, and of course, this is back in the old days when we could buy CDs, or even before that, cassettes, or I don't know, say it. I remember 8 tracks.
Yep.
But we'll say the CD moment. There are times when I would, you'd go buy the CD and be like, I bought the CD to whatever. I want to listen to the sound. I want to listen to the soundtrack to this movie because it's got all this stuff on here. You could buy a soundtrack for 3 films. What are you buying?
Boy, I'm going to try not to say 3 Martin Scorsese films because he's just the king. Well, but my mind, my mind went right to his movie King of Comedy because there's a number of really beautiful, earnest songs. And it does that standard Scorsese thing where. And he did it. The first time I noticed it really was when he did it in Mean Streets. And there's this bar fight, but there's like a girl group song. Like I think it's the Ronettes, Be My Baby, this kind of beautiful girl group song that's kind of ironically, like counterposing with what's happening in this bloody action. But King of Comedy, I just really, and my memory is probably a little faulty here, but I just really remember the music doing a good job of making sure that we saw this humiliating stuff that's happening to the main character with some poignancy. And I just really love that. I love when the soundtrack music actually frames what's happening. One of the problems I have with Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is that in one scene, he'll have like 4 different songs segue, and I'm like, wait, what was that? Wait, what was that? And I can't even keep up with it. So my mind went to King of Comedy. Similarly, my mind went to Midnight Cowboy, and the use of that one song, Everybody's Talking at Me. And again, it's these characters who could, Ratso Rizzo, Dustin Hoffman's character, who could tip into just like being ridiculous. But that song, and it really is just that song. I don't even remember anything else on the soundtrack.
Is that Glenn Campbell? Who sang that?
He might have done a version. The guy in the movie was a guy named Fred Neil, who I don't know too much else about.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah. So my mind went right to those 2, and then I'm just going to pick one of the hip hop movies of the 80s, and I guess I'll pick Less Than Zero because that was one of the movies that really where you were in the theater hearing what was on the soundtrack and thinking like, this is the music that matters now. And it was fairly early for that. I don't want to say a year because I'll get it wrong, but it wasn't in the 90s. It was definitely before like the biggest sort of crossover moment for hip hop. But LL Cool J's on there, doing Going Back to Cali. And it's just so like, it's like, right, this is youth music. This is what and it turned out to be like, we're still living that. So those are going to be my weird 3. Nobody else would say those.
That's perfect.
But that's where my mind went. Yeah.
Have you ever seen Deep Cover?
Yeah.
I think it's a masterpiece. And
Deep Cover, is that the one with Jeff Goldblum and Lawrence Fishburne? Yeah, that's an amazing movie. Yeah.
Bill Duke directs it. I'm dying to get Bill Duke on the pod because I think Deep Cover is it's a masterpiece noir that no one talks about, that I will scream at the top of my lungs.
in an earlier life, my scholarly career was all about Black-Jewish relations, and that was
Oh my God.
that movie. Just those two characters were I was like, oh, they're playing with some very familiar tropes about the kind of nebbishy Jewish guy and the tough Black, and so I remember watching that movie and just being like, oh, this is work for me. This is not fun, that happens to all of us sometimes at the movies, where you realize I have my my thinking brain on too much here. Yeah.
Oh, it's that movie.
Great, I'm totally with you though, Jason.
I want to close out now and kind of ask you the big question here then. Is Once Upon a Time in Hollywood a history film?
Yeah. That's great. I love that question. And it's such a history film in that way that you and I have been talking about, which is like, we go to films about the past because we love narrative and we want to see what kind of stories we can tell, what they'll make us feel, what they'll make us think about, what they invoke. And this is one that, to me, it's the history film that ends the Manson conversation, maybe, because it just let us have that moment of undoing that kind of undergirded every other narrative we've been reading, watching, listening to all along. Sharon Tate lives, that's the headline. It's like such a weird, beautiful, understandable fantasy. And I just think he does it. I mean, I hate him in a lot of ways, but he does it so effectively. He builds you to that moment so carefully, and yet it's still a shock. It's still a shock. It's still a reveal, to use the contemporary language. And so I think it just reminds us that, like, when we watch history films, it's like, I'm not a psychologist. I don't know much psychological language, but like there's all kinds of like projection we're doing. It's a funny word to use in the context of movies, right? There's all this projection we're doing. Like we have these feelings that we want to like have a place for. And like now this movie, like it's such a good place for those feelings that I've been tracking, in my scholarly work on the Manson family for years and years now. And it does it just so effectively. And it just reminds us that we're not going to the movies like we go to class for history, but the kind of history we want the movies is much more about affect and about narratives that fulfill unmet needs or that undo bad things that happen either to us or people we know, right? So it's like what's narrative for, right? And it's I mean, that does that make sense? Like that's what that's the crux of my love-hate relationship with this movie, is I hate what it gives us, but I admire the hell out of how effectively it gives us a revision of the past. And you can't argue with it. He did it. He brought Sharon Tate back to life. It's the first movie about the Manson family, the first anything about the Manson family that Sharon Tate's family has signed off on. And they are horrible right wingers.
Really?
And so it's kind of not, they're at the base of what we now call the victims' rights movement, which is the undergirding of 3 strikes you're out, ending conjugal visits for people in prison. Like they got caught up in this kind of California reactionary politics for reasons that are completely understandable given their loss and heartache, but that they like the Tarantino movie. And they like it because I don't want to speak for them. Obviously I can't, but it's their fantasy as first, right? But more than anybody else's. And that to me is The Girl Lives. It's poignant as hell. Yeah.
Yeah. It matters to people. I get it. Let me ask you this, Jeff, where do you live on Twitter? That's my Captain Segway moment right there. So
where do I live?
Where can people find you?
I am at Melnick Jeffrey 1. That's it. Yeah.
That's awesome. Buddy.
And I love seeing you on Twitter. I love the whole range of people who are talking about music and film and politics and history. And it's a weird, strange public forum, but I'm still there.
Well, here's the reality of it. You can't talk about music and politics and history without talking about the other things. Like history is embedded. Music is part of history. Absolutely. Politics and history are going to be found inside of. It's the reason why we sing to begin with. It's like, Exactly.
Why
we dance is something else entirely. I think it's usually because I had too much to drink, but whatever. So,
that happens too. Yeah.
And I lost a bet or something. So, dude, I can't thank you enough for being here today. This
was
so much fun. And that's a wrap here at Historians of the Movies podcast. Thank you so much to our guest, Dr. Jeffrey Melnick, for stopping in today and talking to us about the 1970s, families, Quentin Tarantino, and of course, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Thank you, of course, to our intrepid producer, Fletcher Powell. You can find him on Twitter at Fletcher_Powell, who is constantly making this show run. Thank you of course, to you guys as well for listening into this podcast. If you get the opportunity, take a second and get on Apple Podcasts or Spotify Podcasts and actually leave a review of the podcast. It helps with the algorithms and all the shit, guys. I'm still learning on this stuff, but anything you can do to support the pod, sharing it and so forth, God, I so very much appreciate it. So thank you so much for being part of this. And keep listening in. This weekend, we actually have another 70s related film we're going to do on Sunday night. Our first official movie of the summer. We're going to do Dazed and Confused. So I hope you can make it in this Sunday night. What the hell? I don't even know what date this Sunday is. Let's take a look at the calendar and tell you. This Sunday night is on June the 4th. So June 4th, Dazed and Confused. I think it's on Amazon Prime. And we're going to live tweet that at 8 p.m. Eastern, as we always do. And if you want to find out more about Historians of the Movies, you can find us at historiansofthemovies.com. You can find the Historians of the Movies at Gmail if you want to email me. There's also an Instagram page. And of course, if you want to find me on Twitter, at Herbert History. So thank you so much for being part of this community as we continue to build it. Hey, we are 6 months in. So thank you so much. We are halfway to a whole year. We've done this shit for a half year. You guys are awesome. Thanks for continuing to listen. Please continue to share this. Tweet this son of a bitch out. Tweet it all. Share it. I don't know. If you're on Blue Sky, share it too. I'm on Blue Sky now. I'm like me and like 19 other people. So anyway, I got to make some pasta. I got to get ready. Ciao for now. Bye and all those things. Love you guys. Talk to you later. Bye.